Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Leaders of South American nations gathered for the first time in 9 years Tuesday for a historical summit in Brazil to unify the politically diverse continent and form a stronger trade bloc. What brought about the summit? How have politics shifted on the continent and throughout Latin America? How do these South American economies view the prospects of a regional trade currency and de-dollarization? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Jorge Heine, former Chilean ambassador to China, Charles Tang, chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Jiang Shixue, professor at Shanghai University, and Brandon Andrews, former Hill staffer and entrepreneur. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Ambassador Heine, I will start with you. We have these leaders and the representatives from these 12 South American countries gathered in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, for this historical summit on Tuesday. People say this is the first in 12 years. First, tell us, why it has taken, so long, almost 10 years, for these leaders to come together.
Yes, that is a great question. And let me underscore again, as you did, the significance of this meeting. In 9 years, South American leaders had not met. And that is because of a variety of reasons. Among others, political divisions that existed in the region, a region which is also very badly hit by various crises, economic crisis, health crisis, the pandemic, and so on. But in the course of the past few years, we have had a new wave of governments being elected in Brazil, in Colombia, in Chile, in Bolivia. These are governments that are committed to regional integration in a way that their predecessors were not. And here I would like to underscore the leadership of President Lula of Brazil, who called this meeting and who ran it and who managed to get such a significant turnout of his counterparts from around the region. The important thing here, it seems to me, is that first of all, that this meeting took place, that it was attended by all the invited presidents, save for the case of the president of Peru, who couldn't attend, who sent a representative. But other than that, they were all there. That's number one. Number two, that they agreed to establish a contact group that will follow up on the meeting, exploring the ways they can further coordinate for fostering regional integration and political coordination. And that three, they agreed to meet again at the date and time to be determined. All of this, it seems to me, is very positive and gives no impetus to a region that has been going through some very difficult moments.
Charles, you are from Brazil and you are familiar with the politics, of course, in this region. So what's your takeaway of the summit?
Well, until very recently, before Lula was elected, the continent, like Ambassador said, were divided. You had, extreme rightist presidents, and you had leftist presidents. And now, basically, except for a few countries, like Paraguay and Guatemala and so on, most of the leaders of South America are, let's say, have the same type of view and the same type of ideology. And so it was much easier. And Lula has always been, during his first two governments, because this is his third time as president, he always gathered all the leaders. He was always leading all the presidents in all the countries in South America to follow a more, let's say, progressive ideology. And he is doing the same now. And he always wanted to create a regional currency. He first went to Argentina and discussed with President Fernandez to create a common currency. And he, of course, when he visited China, he was definitely speaking about why do we have to use the dollar?
Yeah, that's
and so this will happen.
Right, another interesting topic. We'll touch upon that. Professor Jiang Shixue, so there's stress of regional integration. Exactly, what does that mean in terms of they will act as a regional trade bloc dealing with the outside world? How probably that will benefit or be in line with the national interests of regional countries?
Well, I think it's very important for the continent to promote regional integration. However, we have to recognize that there should be stronger political will and other kinds of very effective means to do so, to achieve this kind of target. You know, in Europe, economic integration started in the middle of last century, and almost at the same time, some countries in Central America also created the so-called Central American Common Market. So after 70 years, in Europe, we have seen a common currency and other kinds of very, very good results of economic integration. But in Central America or South America or the Caribbean, well, we cannot see any really tangible results of pushing forward economic relationship. Well, if you want to talk about economic integration uh, in Latin America, you have to have very, very good memory, okay? So my memory is not good. So sometimes I really cannot remember the names of so many organizations, okay? So yesterday, there was one organization, and tomorrow, maybe the organization will disappear. And the day after tomorrow, there will be new one. So in, in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, there are so many regional organizations. It's really more fire than, more smoke than fire. Or in Chinese, we say more sound, less rain. So I hope that Latin America really should do something to promote economic integration in a genuine sense.
In a genuine sense. Brandon, we'll come back to that a little bit. The summit also attempted to revive the regional bloc, previously known as the Union of South American Nations. But obviously, at the summit, they also tried not to make this summit as an effort to revive such a union. Why this caution?
Well, this is certainly a beginning and not an end. As was mentioned, the previous uh, effort to unite South American countries blew up somewhat because of the support of Hugo Chavez and many of the countries, many of the leaders kind of pulling out of the previous agreement. I think President Lula certainly sees this as a new opportunity, a new beginning, not only economically, which is important because, as was mentioned, many of these economies in South America have been struggling. Brazil is certainly an outlier in a positive way. But to start with building relationships, there was kind of a symbolic moment where all of the leaders joined hands together and took a photo. And so I think that relationship building, beginning some regular meetings, is going to be really important if they'll be able to kind of put back together or have a new iteration of that former beginning to link the South American nations.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Heine, Professor Jiang mentioned about, of course, the questions I guess people have in their mind, whether, whatever initiative there will be, whether that will be put into practice, and then probably, outcome will come out of that kind of initiative. Do you see that as, one of the probably potential challenges?
Yes, absolutely. Now, Professor Jiang, of course, is right that there is a real smorgasbord of regional integration schemes of many acronyms that it is difficult to keep track, even for people like us who study them systematically. Now, that said, I have a somewhat different view, I would say that there is a variable geometry in which different subregions in Latin America have different needs and behave accordingly. Now, the main thing it seems to me is to revive both a mechanism of regional integration in South America, which is what we're talking about, and two, to achieve a greater degree of political coordination. Those two things are extremely important. We live in a globalized but troubled world, and the region needs to speak with one voice. The example of ASEAN, for example, is very relevant for us, how they manage to work together despite their political differences. And that, it seems to me, is the direction we should go. I am encouraged by President Lula's initiative. I think the fact that all these presidents attended the meeting is a very important first step. There remain differences. There remain differences on the issue of Venezuela. There are other differences as well. But the main thing is that movement is taking place, and it is in the right direction.
Ambassador, do you see this as an or step forward in terms of the revival of the Union of South American nations?
Well, again, this is the main thing that Brazil is promoting. Colombia has just announced that it will also rejoin UNASUR, which was basically, disbanded a couple of years ago by the previous crop of elected governments. Other governments have somewhat different view. They think that perhaps a different sort of organization should emerge. But it seems to me the takeaway is that South America will rebuild a new political space that will allow these countries to coordinate, to work together, and to move forward in a way that they haven't in the recent past.
Well, Charles, earlier you mentioned about ideological affinity, I guess, among the nations. Most of them are left-wing governments. Let's say it's easier for them probably to strike a deal or to reach an agreement. But do you see there's a danger probably if there's a right-wing government for the next election, next circle, and then there would be, like what happened in the past, some country will say walk out or quit this is a group, and then we'll fracture it.
Not necessarily. Let's take Mercosur. Mercosur is a union, economic union and trade union uniting 4 countries, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. In the last government, President Bolsonaro was, let's say, the Trump of South America. And the president of Paraguay, of course, is also a right-wing government. But even with these ideological differences, Mercosur has been stuck together for many decades. And it's still going to be stuck together despite the fact that Paraguay president is still a right-wing president.
So there's a a demonstration of this high degree of being practical or practicality in terms of cooperation, at least on the issues of trade and investment. Charles?
Absolutely. Mercosur volume of trade between the 4 countries is very significant, and there's plenty of cooperation between these countries, these 4 countries, and I believe that this could be expanded to include other countries. And I think that President Lula has always shown, since his first government, he's always shown a leadership role of wanting to unite the South American countries to become a single bloc. It's not always easy, but UNASUR, for example, under President Lula, will certainly be very significant again.
Yeah, will be very significant again. That seems like a. Oh, Ambassador, you want to jump in?
Yes. Can I add something?
Go ahead, please.
On that. On UNASUR, it is important to underscore the following. One of the lessons that has been drawn from the ultimate failure of UNASUR, the fact that it basically came to an end, is that it became, in fact, too ideologically driven, and that sort of the political ideology of the different governments started to interfere with the running of the organization. And it seems to me that one lesson that all governments that met in Brasilia have learned is that this cannot happen again, and that UNASUR, if it is rebuilt, must be, ideologically neutral. It must be a big tent that incorporates all governments, whatever their political ideology. Otherwise, when there's a change of government in any country, the organizations enters into crisis. So that, it seems to me, is an important lesson that has been learned.
So Brandon, I mean, you are an entrepreneur, you are from the business, obviously. Ideological differences probably should set aside. Instead, people should focus on pragmatic cooperation that will, say, mutually beneficial or win-win, and then you can carry on for a long time to come. Is that the case also for the regional countries, probably to cooperate, to work together, to build a bloc, to build a unity?
Yeah, I remember a quote from the conference. The Secretary for Latin America and the Caribbean from Brazil said, "We need something permanent that doesn't depend on particular government and who's in power." And I think that really underscores the point that the ambassador was making. They've got to unite and move forward together, and also have an organization, economic or otherwise, that can supersede whatever political winds may be blowing. I think entrepreneurship, business is a great piece of that. One of the bigger issues, in addition to the struggling economies, is climate, and wanting to make sure that South America protects the incredible natural resources that are there. Here's one example from Colombia. There's a small business called Beefly, which is using the black soldier fly insect to make protein-rich animal feed in a way that saves water, saves natural resources, and produces it in a way that's much more affordable. And so that kind of economic innovation on top of the relationship building, I think, can create that core that'll be necessary to, again, make sure that whatever acronym we're calling this agreement moving forward, that it stands the test of time, unlike UNASUR and some of the previous attempts.
Do you think, with this, sense of, let's say, being pragmatic, practical, and also the sense of flexibility, it makes no difference, like the right-wing government or left-wing government, let's focus on what we can do together. Let's focus on the common interest, probably, by forming this trade bloc, that obviously will be in the interest of each member, or, regional countries of South America here. You think there's a strong consensus, or they are on the way to build such a consensus?
I think there's a consensus that something better needs to be done in terms of broader economic policy. Is there consensus around a South American currency? Is there consensus around immigration policy? Is there consensus around even some of the environmental policies and how much to protect versus how much to use to try to grow those economies in South America? I think there's a range of opinions there. However, they're all at the starting point of saying, hey, we realize that what's happened in the past isn't working. Let's try to find that common denominator, which I think could be trade, could be the economy, could be especially some of these innovative small businesses that have solutions that, again, are not only going to hire more people and drive economic change, but also hit some of those other pieces, which some of the countries have said are important.
Professor Jiang Shixue, at the summit was also the Venezuela President Maduro, and his presence is a bit controversial. Is warmly welcomed by President Lula, but two other participants were not that completely agreeing with his presence. What do you make of that? Will that become somehow an obstacle for further integration of this region?
The past 2 decades, the question of Venezuela has been a kind of very, very important issue, sometimes dividing the continent of Latin America. Well, I don't know why it's already 20 years past. And the Venezuela issue is still a problem for today's summit of the South American countries. Particularly, I feel quite strange that some kind of criticism coming from Chile. Chile is considered a country under the leadership of the left-wing political force. So I don't know why Chile is not happy about Venezuela. Well, I hope that this kind of division will be resolved very soon. Let's hope that there would be more unity and less diversity. So that would be very important for the continent to push forward economic integration. Otherwise, it's like that would be a kind of talk show.
Ambassador Heine, yes, go ahead. And how big a problem
Yes.
is the presence of Venezuela
Yes.
or disagreement
Yes.
on this country?
Sure. Let me underscore the following. In the view of the government of Chile, the question of Venezuela is not a matter of right or left. It is a question of the human rights situation in Venezuela and the human rights violations that have been taking place there. So, what President Boric did was to say that he was happy that Venezuela was rejoining the multilateral fold and was participating in meeting with all of the other countries in South America. But at the same time, he expressed his concern about the human rights situation in Venezuela.
Ambassador, on the different, changing the gear, of course, another topic is really about de-dollarization. Why the necessity of having probably originally based, let's say, trade currency that will replace probably the dominance of US dollars?
Well, let me say the following. It seems to me that these notions that have been put forward, and President Lula has been quite, upfront about this, about coming up with some sort of regional currency. The way I see it, this is something very much for the long term. I don't see this is something happening in the near or medium term. What I think will happen, is already happening, of course, is that countries like Brazil and Argentina will start using much more, say, the renminbi for their trade with China, which they are already doing, and less using less of the dollar. But I really don't see a switch to a regional currency as something that will happen in the near or medium term.
Well, Charles,
Can I add one point?
Go ahead.
Can I
Professor
add
Jiang.
one point?
Yes.
Well, as far as I can remember, President Lula has put forward 4 proposals. If your memory is good enough, 4 kind of proposals. One, the common currency for Argentina and Brazil. Second, the common currency for Mercosur. Third, the common currency for the BRICS. And 4, the common currency as a common currency for the whole continent of South America. Well, I would agree with Ambassador Heine that it is really a kind of ambitious dream. I think even in the long term, I don't believe that one of these 4 common currencies will come into being. It's still a lofty dream.
Okay, a lofty dream. Charles, yes, it takes a long time to build the change, I guess. But why the necessity? Why the national leaders, in particular, President Lula, sees it's necessary probably to have their own currency to replace the role of US dollar?
I think that the agreement between the Central Bank of Brazil and the People's Bank of China of using the renminbi and using the real for the trade between these countries, the 2 countries, will be very helpful for the trade. It will lower the costs, and it will not go through the dollar system. And, today, part of Brazilian reserves are already in renminbi, okay? Almost 5% of Brazilian foreign currency reserves are in the Chinese currency. I agree that, to have a common currency will be very difficult. Imagine the inflation rate of Argentina versus the inflation rate of Brazil. Having a common currency will be very difficult. But, however, I want to stress that the business commercial integration, economic commercial integration is possible. Again, Mercosur is a solid example that through the decades, regardless of the ideology of each government, of each of the participant countries, it has been permanent and it has been a very strong economic and commercial integration between the four countries. And President Lula would like to expand Mercosur to include other countries as well.
Brandon, how do you see the likelihood of a new, regional currency that will help the country reduce their dependency on the U.S. dollar?
Yeah, I think from the U.S. perspective, there will be significant support for increased integration, increased cooperation in South America. I think the only question when you talk about new regional currency is stability. I think using the current currencies for trade agreements, etc., certainly has some merit when you look at trade costs. However, the big question is, will a new currency upset an economic system and upset economies that in some ways are already struggling? I think there's some risk there. However, I know that the steps will be taken to try to get it there. But again, the biggest thing here is less about currency, less about policy, but making sure that everyone's on the same page to move together. Whatever decision they decide to make, if they're all moving together, it's certainly going to be a powerful, not only economic bloc, but a powerful force in the world when we think about, again, climate and some of these issues that are of particular interest to the countries in South America, where their voices really need to be heard.
Yeah, consensus is critical. Lastly, Ambassador, recently there's a piece, carried by the Financial Times, saying that the reluctance, on the side of the U.S. and European countries to reach trade agreement with countries in this region or Latin America somehow is doing a disservice to Washington and Brussels, in particular, vis-a-vis to the influence of China here. I wonder, what do you make of that?
Yes, I thought it was a fascinating piece because it reflects the change that we have seen in the course of the past decade or so in terms of free trade. It used to be that the great champions of free trade were the United States and the United Kingdom. Nowadays, they talk about fair trade. I'm not quite sure what fair trade is, but it expresses itself in the fact that the United States is no longer signing any free trade agreements. In the case of Ecuador, is the most dramatic one. Ecuador wanted to sign a free trade agreement with the United States, and the United States said, no, we're not signing any FTAs anymore. So Ecuador goes to China and signs a free trade agreement with China.
Yes.
So today, the big champion of free trade is China.
Okay.
And the United States and the United Kingdom.
So, Ambassador, we have to cut you off there. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks for our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.